All right. Thank you guys for joining this presentation. We're going to briefly discuss how portability works in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And we'll open up the session at the end for frequently asked questions or questions that you may have with regards to this. So before we get into portability, it's really important for you guys to understand what the Housing Choice Voucher Program really is, because without understanding that, there's absolutely no way to understand what portability is. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program is the federal government's major program for assisting very low-income families, the elderly, and the disabled to afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market. Okay, so this is going to allow, it's the biggest program that allows low-income families, elderly and disabled families, to rent in the private market. The assistance is provided on behalf of the family or an individual. It's not necessarily attached to a unit. The program allows participants to find their own housing, including single-family homes, townhouses, and apartments. Once they find this housing, a subsidy is paid to the landlord directly by the housing authority on behalf of the participating family. And the family then pays the difference between the actual rent charged by the landlord and the amount subsidized by the program. So this means that there are times where the housing authority does not pay for the entire amount. There are calculations that are required, okay? The family may pay a portion and the housing authority pays a portion. The amount on the rent is determined by the housing authority. So a couple HCV basics. A family that is issued a housing choice voucher is responsible for finding a suitable housing unit of the family's choice where the owner agrees to rent under the program. So you've got the family looking for a unit in the private market, which means we have landlords that we work with in the housing choice voucher program. And in order for the owner to participate in the program, he needs to agree to rent under the program. Now, the last presentation we did was on the HAP contract, and the HAP contract goes into the specific on what the owner is agreeing to. So if you haven't watched that video, please make sure you go back and watch the video on the HAP contract. The family is not prohibited from renting the unit from which they currently live in right now. So if they're currently renting a unit and they're coming off of the waiting list, they could potentially rent that unit if the owner agrees to participate under the program. Now, all of the units in the program have to meet a minimum standard of health and safety, and this is determined under HQS, so it's housing quality standards. This is the inspection requirement. Now, what is a public housing authority? The public housing authority is the agency that administers the housing choice voucher program locally. The housing authority receives federal funds, so this is a federal program by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to administer the voucher program. So they get HUD, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, flows the money down to a local public housing authority, and they do that through a contract, okay? In that contract, the housing authority is responsible to administer a housing choice voucher program in accordance with federal regulations. Now, where do they administer the program? The state and local law establishes the jurisdiction by which the housing agency is allowed to conduct business and provide assistance. So the state and local law is going to establish what is the jurisdiction of the housing authority where they can provide housing choice voucher assistance. Now, one of the key things, and if it's not the main thing of the housing choice voucher program, is moving without losing assistance. So we already talked about the housing authority, that family gets to rent their own unit. They go out and they select a unit. It is the family's responsibility to select a unit with a landlord or an owner that is willing to participate in the program. The whole point of the Housing Choice Voucher Program is the family's ability to move without losing assistance. Unlike public housing, which is typically called like the projects or low-income housing, where the assistance belongs in the unit, right? If the family moves out of that unit, they would lose the assistance. With the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the family gets to take their assistance wherever they move. So for example, if family's housing needs are going to change over time with changes in family size, job locations, and for other reasons like medical, school, okay? The Housing Choice Voucher Program is specifically designed to allow families to move without losing their housing assistance. This means that they can move anywhere pretty much in the United States. This means that the biggest part of the Housing Choice Program is moving with assistance. Now, moves are permissible as long as the family notifies the PHA ahead of time, terminates its existing lease with that lease provision, and finds acceptable alternate housing. Now, families that are in violation of the program are not going to be allowed to move. Where can a family select a unit with the HCV program? They can go anywhere in the United States, the U.S. Virgin Islands, or Puerto Rico. These all states in the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, have housing choice voucher programs. The U.S. Virgin Islands also has housing choice voucher programs, so St. John and St. Thomas, St. Thomas and St. Croix, and Puerto Rico also has housing choice voucher program. So under the program, voucher holders may choose a unit anywhere in the United States if the family lived in its jurisdiction of the PHA issuing the voucher when the family applied for assistance. So what is portability? Portability is a process that an HCV participant or applicant elects to move outside the original housing authority's jurisdiction with assistance. It is considered a move. It only applies, portability only applies to the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It does not apply to project-based vouchers or mod rehab. Okay, that's really important. Now, here's a couple definitions that we're briefly going to discuss just for the purposes of understanding how to apply them. We've got jurisdiction, initial housing authority, receiving housing authority, absorb or absorption, administering and billing, resident and original application. Jurisdiction is the area which the public housing authority is authorized by the state or local law to administer housing choice voucher program. So in a lot of states or counties, you're going to have a county housing authority and a city housing authority, okay? The city's jurisdiction would only cover the city, but the county's jurisdiction is going to cover the entire county. That means that they're only allowed, if you have a city housing authority, they're only allowed to administer the voucher within the city. If the family wishes to move out of that city, then they would have to move out under portability, and we would have to send them to the housing authority that covers the jurisdiction in which they want to move. The initial housing authority is that housing authority that it issues the original voucher when they're coming off of the waiting list under its allocated funding, or has absorbed the family in a period of their time and the family's assistance into their program. So pretty much the initial housing authority is a housing authority that pays, okay? It's where they've attached the voucher to the funding specifically. So if they're not the initial housing authority, then they'll be the receiving housing authority under portability. The receiving housing authority is the housing authority who administers an HCV program and is receiving a family under a portability move. They are required, if they have an HCV program, they are required to receive the family and administer the voucher according to their policies and procedures. So they cannot deny portability, a family porting in simply because they don't want to. Absorbing. Again, these are some of the terms that you're going to hear when it comes to portability. Absorb is the point at which a receiving housing authority starts making assistance payments with its allocated funding rather than billing the initial PHA. So the typical process is the initial housing authority receives a request from a family that they want to port out to a different jurisdiction. Okay, so let's say, for example, a family that is with Miami-Dade Housing Authority wants to move to Orlando Housing Authority. Okay, if the voucher is attached to Miami-Dade's funding, they are the initial housing authority. The initial housing authority will then send the family's assistance or the voucher and portability paperwork to Orlando Housing Authority. Orlando Housing Authority has two options. They have to decide, and again, this is an example, they have to decide, am I going to absorb the voucher or am I going to bill the housing authority? The initial housing authority is going to assume that they're going to be billed unless the receiving housing authority says we're going to absorb them. All that means is, hey, you're going to send me this family from your voucher allocations, not a problem. If we're going to absorb them, that means we're going to make this family one of our own families, and initial housing authority, you can go ahead and issue this voucher somewhere else. Okay? But there's a rule with absorbing. The receiving housing authority cannot, will not, may not absorb the family into its own program until the receiving housing authority has executed a HAP contract on behalf of the family. Now, we talked about HAP contracts in the last training session. The HAP contract does not become fully executed until the owner and the housing authority have signed and dated that HAP contract. So if a receiving housing authority is wanting to absorb a family, they only do it at the time the HAP contract is executed. Before then, it is an intent to absorb, but it's not an actual absorption. Meaning, if they're Miami-Dade Housing Authority client moving to Orlando Housing Authority, they remain a Miami-Dade Housing Authority paid client until Orlando Housing Authority decides to absorb them. So that brings me to administering and billing. If the housing authority is deciding to administer a voucher, they're going to receive payments from the initial housing authority, but they're going to administer that voucher in accordance to their policies and procedures. This does have an effect on the families, okay? And we're going to talk about the effects of this in just a few minutes. Here are a couple things that family needs to know with portability and how portability works. Subsidy standards. Subsidy standards are the policies that establish the size bedroom on a voucher that will determine how much the agency will pay. So the subsidy standards, the number of bedrooms on a voucher, all that means is how much the housing authority is going to pay. This does not mean that the family has to rent. If they get issued a 2-bedroom voucher, a 3-bedroom voucher, it doesn't mean that they have to rent a 2. That just means that the housing authority is only going to pay the value of a 2. We don't tell a family how they have to sleep or their sleeping arrangements. When we say you have a 2-bedroom voucher or you have a 3-bedroom voucher, that means we're only going to pay subsidy based on a 2-bedroom voucher amount or a 3-bedroom voucher amount, regardless of how the family sleeps. Under portability, the receiving housing authority may have different subsidy standards. In other words, the initial housing authority may have issued a family a 3-bedroom voucher, but when they get to the receiving housing authority needs to use their local policies on subsidy standards, and they may issue a 2-bedroom voucher. Okay, the subsidy standards under portability is based on the receiving housing authorities subsidy standards. So there is a risk that the family is taking that the subsidy standards may go down or they may go up under portability. All of the PHA's subsidy standards, regardless of where they go with assistance, must comply with fair housing and civil rights laws. And this includes processing reasonable accommodation requests that are necessary for qualified individuals with disabilities. Now, payment standards. So we talked about subsidy standards. That's the way we issue vouchers, okay? 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, right? 1 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms. It's how we allocate bedroom size on the vouchers. And it's based on family composition. That was subsidy standards. Now, under payment standards is the actual amount, okay? So whether it's $800, $900, $1,000, $1,200, that is what the payment standards represents. And it's established by the housing authorities. They have a schedule by which they say, okay, my 1-bedroom vouchers is X amount. My 2-bedroom vouchers is X amount. My 3-bedroom vouchers is X amount. Under portability, the receiving housing authority may have different payment standards than the initial housing authority. And they will be different. No matter where you go, every single housing authority is going to have different payment standard amounts. Now, payment standards are what determine the amount of the rent that the PHA will pay on the family's behalf. If a receiving PHA's payment standards are lower than the initial PHA, the portion of the rent the family pays may be more than what they are paying at the initial PHA. So you're going to get people that are families that may say, well, when I was at Miami-Dade Housing Authority, I was paying $700 for rent, but now when I'm at Broward County Housing Authority, I'm having to pay $900 worth of rent. There are 2 things that affect that. Subsidy standards, which is how we issue the voucher. Payment standards, which is how we pay on a voucher, okay? When a family chooses to port out from the initial housing authority's jurisdiction, subsidy standards may change. Payment standards may also change. The families need to know that. Another thing that a family needs to know is that the receiving housing authority can rescreen them using their own policies, which may be different than the initial PHA and could result in them denying portability. So when that family is contacting the receiving housing authority, or when the initial housing authority is contacting the receiving housing authority, the family may want to ask whether they're rescreen families moving into their area under portability, and what are their policies for termination or denial of HCV assistance. So rescreening is like criminal background checks. They may deny for criminal background checks. Understanding if the receiving housing authority is going to rescreen will assist the family in determining if the receiving housing authority's policies might prevent them from moving to their jurisdiction. The family may change their mind. They say, well, under my initial housing authority, I didn't need to have any criminal within the last 5 years. Now, when I go to the receiving housing authority, they're saying, well, we're looking at the last 10 years. So that's a policy that may affect a family under portability. Now, with portability, like any other move, time management is critical and it's really important. When under portability, because we're dealing with 2 housing authorities, with 2 timelines, with 2 different ways of handling vouchers and families, time management becomes even more critical. A family needs to manage the move so that they may have enough time to arrive at the receiving housing authority before the initial housing authority voucher expires. Otherwise, they will lose their assistance. They may lose it. Now, what happens if the families, once the family is at the receiving housing authority? These are the things that you guys, that you need to understand how a family is affected by porting out. The receiving PHA will issue the family a voucher to search for a unit in its jurisdiction. So once the initial housing authority sends their paperwork to the receiving housing authority, the receiving housing authority is going to issue a family voucher that allows them to look in its jurisdiction. The voucher time automatically at the receiving housing authority will be extended 30 days from the expiration date on the voucher issued by the initial PHA. So the initial PHA's voucher expires at a certain time. The receiving housing authority automatically has to issue an additional 30 days. This is regulatory, okay? So all housing authorities have to comply with this. If the family changes their mind and they say they do not want to lease a unit in the receiving housing authority's jurisdiction, the receiving housing authority has to return their paperwork and the voucher to the initial housing authority. Now, the clock is ticking. The whole time that this is happening, the clock is ticking. The initial housing authority is not required to, once they receive the paperwork, but may extend the term of the voucher so that the family may search for a unit in the initial housing authority's jurisdiction or port out to another jurisdiction. So what happens if the voucher expires? If the family is not currently leased under a HAP contract or under a HAP contract, the family loses their assistance. And if the voucher expires, the family is not entitled to an informal hearing, which is like a dispute or an appeal, if the voucher time expires and they're not under HAP contract. So this is why voucher time is really important for the families. This is why managing portability correctly is really important, because the clock is ticking, and the family, if they find themselves not housed under a unit and their voucher expires, they lose their assistance. So it's really important for us to understand that under time management, that's really critical. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and open it up for you guys for questions that you may have. Let me go back. Okay, so Stacy has a question. And the question is, does the RFTA stop the time on the voucher? Yes. The moment the RFTA is turned in, the time stops. The time that it's taking the housing authority to process the RFTA, the family does not lose that time. And if the RFTA is denied, the family is given that time back. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you guys, or you can unmute yourself. Do you guys have any questions? I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions under portability. Okay, any questions? Now I'm opening it up for questions with Miami-Dade specifically. The question is, so once a family has a voucher, they're giving 30 days. This ties, pause, or stops when during the review of the RFTA, correct? So the initial voucher is always issued at every housing authority, doesn't matter what housing authority the family's at or they go to, for 60 days. So the family has 60 days to look for a unit. Now, housing authorities may have additional time that they automatically grant without needing an extension. So let's say, I'm just going to use 60 days as an example because every housing authority has to give a minimum of 60 days. So let's say, for example, on the 20th day, they turn in an RFTA. And the housing authority took 10 days to process that RFTA, and at the end of those 10 days, the family was denied the RFTA, or the RFTA was denied. That 10-day period that the housing authority used to review the RTA, the family does not lose that, and they get pretty much an additional 10 days, or they haven't lost that time. So they still have, if they used up 20 days, on the 20th day, they submitted the RTA. If they have 60 days, that means they still have 40 days to look for a unit. Does that answer the question? You guys can also raise your hand in the chat if you have any question. I got confirmation that the question was answered. The next question is, can a family put in a request for port out, like by filling out any doc, or is it just submitting a COD? That's a great question, Elimar.